Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're opening up an explainer on one of the most famously debated, deeply misunderstood, and honestly historically complex documents in human history, the Manusmriti. Now, whether you've heard it praised as this ancient moral compass or completely condemned as a blueprint for social hierarchy, there is a massive gap between what people think this text is and what historical evidence actually shows us.
So here's the big question to get our gears turning today. What if history's most famous law code wasn't actually, well, a law? We usually just assume ancient Indian kings ruled using the strict edicts of the Manusmriti. But what if its reputation as this rigid, universal legal constitution is actually just a massive historical accident?
To figure this out, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll decode what the Manusmriti actually is. Then, we'll look inside the ancient text itself. After that, we'll uncover the mystery of its lost manuscripts and contradictions. Fourth, we'll examine the dramatic British colonial pivot that kind of changed everything. And finally, we'll look at the controversies and its modern legacy today. Let's get into it.
Section 1. Decoding the Manusmriti. Tracing the origins of the Manava Dharmaśāstra. So the Manusmriti belongs to a genre called Dharmaśāstra, and it's really crucial to understand here that it wasn't the only text of its kind. It was just one of many ancient Hindu texts concerning duties, rights, laws, conduct, and virtues. Written in metric verses or shlokas, the text actually frames itself as a dialogue. It's presented as this grand discourse given by an exalted teacher, Manu, and his student, Bhrigu, who are speaking to disciples, eager to learn about all the various aspects of Dharma.
Okay, so when was it actually written? Looking at the estimated dates, I can tell you this wasn't drafted over a weekend. While early scholars tried to date it way back to 1250 BCE, modern linguistics place it firmly after the late Vedic texts. The general consensus now is that it was composed and compiled by multiple authors over a really long stretch of time, somewhere between 200 BCE and 200 CE. And it didn't just pop out of nowhere, you know? It drew on a huge accumulation of knowledge from older texts and sutras, many of which are completely lost to history today.
Moving on to Section 2, Inside the Ancient Text, Statecraft, Karma, and Social Classes. The Manusmriti outlines 4 proper and just sources of law, or dharma. It lists the entire Veda, tradition and customs, and the conduct of virtuous people. But what's absolutely fascinating here is that 4th source, Atmana Santushti, which translates to self-satisfaction. This brilliantly illustrates that the text recognized personal conscience, what is pleasing to oneself, as a legitimate foundational source of moral law. It wasn't just top-down rules. It appealed directly to your own individual ethical compass. However, we have to look at who it was written for. The text's audience was highly specific. When we break down its 2,685 verses, the vast majority of the text, over 1,000 verses, is dedicated entirely to the Brahmins, the priestly class. Another 971 verses focus on the Kshatriyas, the kings and warriors. The rules for the merchant and working classes, the Vaishyas and Shudras, are extraordinarily brief in comparison. Scholars actually suggest this disproportionate focus was very intentional. It was likely composed to address the balance of power between political leaders and priestly interests during a pretty turbulent era of foreign invasions in ancient India. Section 3, Contradictions and Lost Manuscripts, the Mystery of the Authentic Version. This brings us to a really fascinating twist in the scholarship. Because, as it turns out, the text we read today is far from a unified original. There's just sheer internal contradiction throughout it. On one hand, you have verses like 3.55, which declare that women must be honored and revered, and that where women aren't revered, no religious rite bears any fruit. Beautiful, right? But then, literally in the same document, verse 5.148 states that a woman must never seek to live independently. This stark contrast proves a major scholarly consensus. The text was heavily redacted, changed, and subjected to numerous later interpolations. It's inconsistent because it was edited by many, many different hands over centuries. Even Mahatma Gandhi noticed this. He famously said, "There are so many contradictions in the printed volume that if you accept one part, you are bound to reject those parts that are wholly inconsistent with it." Gandhi concluded that nobody is actually in possession of the original text. In fact, modern scholars estimate that less than half of the verses in the Manusmriti we have today might actually be authentic to the original composition. Mind-blowing, right?
So, you're probably wondering, where did the version we have today even come from? Well, over 50 manuscripts have been discovered, and they are wildly inconsistent with one another. The most famous one is the Kolkata manuscript, which features a commentary by a medieval writer named Kalukabata. For centuries, this was presumed to be the definitive, authentic text. But modern scholars have discovered this presumed authenticity is completely false. It became the famous Vulgate text not because it was the most accurate, but honestly simply because it was the lucky version that was found first.
Which leads us to arguably the most crucial turning point in this history. Section 4. The British colonial pivot, searching for a Hindu Sharia.
Let's see how this builds the world we know today. Picture this. It's the 18th century, and the British East India Company is consolidating its power in India. To govern smoothly, they decided to apply Islamic law to Muslims, but they needed a similar codified legal system for Hindus and non-Muslims. So, in 1794, Sir William Jones translated the Manusmriti. The British effectively resurrected this specific manuscript from relative obscurity and used it to actively construct an Anglo-Hindu positive law.
The historical mistake here was massive. The British mistook a fluid, philosophical commentary on morals, ideals, and ethics for a rigid, universal code of law. As legal scholar Abdullahi Ahmed an-Naim explains, British colonial administrators took centuries of vigorous, dynamic social systems and just froze them to fit their own preconceived European notions of what law should be. There's literally no historical evidence that ancient Indian kings actually ever implemented the Manusmriti as state law. It was an ideal, not a statute. But the British colonial courts made it a literal law, fundamentally altering its destiny forever.
This historical collision course brings us to Section 5, Controversies and Modern Legacy, the socio-political debate today.
Today, the text sits at the absolute center of intense socio-political debate, largely because of its prescriptions regarding social hierarchy. For instance, Chapter 8, verse 410 states that a Shudra, the artisan and working class, is not released from servitude even if emancipated, claiming that servitude is innate. The text also contains verses prohibiting Shudras from studying certain texts or performing specific rituals, firmly assigning them a subordinate status.
Now, these restrictive verses have fueled heavy modern criticism for institutionalizing caste hierarchy and justifying marginalization. And this sparked a profound civil rights pushback. Most notably, in 1927, the pioneering social reformer Dr. B.R. Ambedkar famously burned copies of the Manusmriti. This was a powerful, symbolic protest against its historical influence on caste discrimination and untouchability.
So, the crucial takeaway here is that today we are left with two deeply opposed viewpoints regarding the text's legacy. The traditionalist view argues that the rules in the text were highly context-specific to a turbulent ancient society. They believe it was intended to functionally organize society rather than to dehumanize it, emphasizing the text's broader ethical teachings. In stark contrast, the reformist view, which is shared by feminist movements and anti-caste reformers, argues that regardless of intent, the text fundamentally institutionalized rigid caste hierarchies and patriarchal control, making it a source of enduring social inequality.
And that leaves us with this final, profound question to consider today. How does a single, heavily redacted manuscript, translated by a British administrator in the 18th century, continue to alter the destiny and civil debates of an entire civilization today? It is a striking reminder of how ancient texts, the random accidents of history, and colonial interventions all combine to shape our modern reality. I hope this explainer gave you a much clearer, structured understanding of the Manusmriti. Thanks for learning with me today, and keep questioning the history behind the headlines. Many historical accounts treat the Manusmriti as the ancient penal code of India, a universally applied set of statutes that dictated every facet of social life and punishment for over 2 millennia. Yet the archaeological record contains a glaring absence. No evidence suggests that any historical Indian state ever utilized the Manusmriti as an active statutory legal code. The modern perception of the text as a legal manual traces back to 1794, with the publication of Sir William Jones's English translation, titled The Institutes of Hindu Law. Historically, the text functioned as a theoretical resource on Dharma, a Sanskrit term encompassing normative ethics and moral theology, rather than enforceable legislation. The effort to turn the Manusmriti into positive law represented an epistemological error by British colonial administrators, who mistook moral discourse for a state constitution. We are going to trace how this transition from fluid manuscripts to a rigid written code overrode centuries of localized customary practices in South Asia. Understanding this shift reveals how the misclassification of a philosophical text provided the legal mechanism to restructure South Asian society, giving theoretical hierarchies the unprecedented weight of state-enforced law. Composed between 200 BCE and 200 CE, the text is a composite work, a crystallization of various traditions and authors, rather than a single legislative decree. This decentralized history left us with more than 50 differing versions discovered across the subcontinent. These internal contradictions are profound, simultaneously praising the honoring of women while demanding their absolute subjugation. It also defines Atmana Santushti, the satisfaction of one's own conscience, as a source of Dharma, framing conduct as a personal moral pursuit rather than a matter for state enforcement. These were palm leaf manuscripts, handmade and locally transmitted, existing in a physical reality far removed from the mass-produced legal volumes of the British Empire. In the late 18th century, British officials in Calcutta discovered one specific version of the manuscript featuring a commentary by Kuluka Bhatta, and they arbitrarily elevated it as the supreme authority. The British presumed this single version was the authentic, singular ancient original that had supposedly governed India for centuries. Modern critical scholarship, led by Patrick Olivelle, has since proven this Vulgate version was actually an 18th century construction, heavily influenced by later interpolations and 11th century plagiarism. In their search for a definitive legal standard, colonial administrators took a specific, historically altered manuscript and established it as the immutable standard for all of Hindu law. The 18th century East India Company was a corporate entity focused on extracting profit while maintaining political control with minimal administrative cost. They looked for established precedents to simplify governance, quickly adopting Sharia for Muslim populations, based on existing codified texts like the Fatwa-e-Alamgiri. To manage non-Muslims, Governor-General Warren Hastings issued a mandate in 1772 requiring a singular textual equivalent, which he termed the Shastra, to serve as the basis for Hindu civil law. British officials applied European jurisprudential categories like property and contracts to a South Asian system that did not separate moral conduct from legal process.
This mirrored a European understanding of law, but bore little resemblance to how medieval Indian kings actually operated. Historical evidence shows that medieval states relied on a variety of more liberal texts, like the Yajnavalkya Smriti, and dynamic local traditions rather than a single rigid code. However, the British system required written, ancient proof for its courts. By privileging the translated Manusmriti, colonial judges systematically ignored and suppressed the diverse, undocumented local customs of the population. Anglo-Hindu law was the byproduct of this administrative convenience, forcing a fluid South Asian moral philosophy into the rigid architecture of a European courtroom. Moving the focus from the text to the society it governed, we see how this transition from ethics to statutes altered the status of marginalized groups. Previously dynamic customary laws, which often evolved to meet social needs, were essentially frozen by colonial codification, solidifying into an unyielding legal framework. This process specifically targeted women's autonomy. The British overlooked verses that granted women property rights or allowed them to exit abusive marriages. Instead, the colonial courts emphasized verses that demanded female subordination, institutionalizing a patriarchal structure that was far more absolute than previous customary practices. Because the British lacked linguistic and cultural depth, they relied on Orthodox Brahmin intermediaries to translate and interpret these ancient laws. This reliance led to the Brahminization of the law, where the specific theoretical ideals of the priestly class were universally imposed upon the varied realities of lower caste communities. These restrictive views on Shudras, once theoretical moral prescriptions, became an institutionalized reality, contributing directly to the hardening of the caste hierarchy into a rigid legal structure. In 1927, reformer B.R. Ambedkar famously led a public burning of the Manusmriti, targeting it as the architectural source of an institutionalized caste oppression that had been reinforced by colonial state power. By stripping these verses of their evolving context, colonial codification locked the status of women and lower castes into a permanent state-enforced underclass.
The Manusmriti that dominates modern legal and political debate is in many ways an 18th century colonial invention. The British took a localized guide for normative ethics and built an imposing legal infrastructure around it, treating philosophy as if it were a mandatory state code.
This transformation provided the administrative machinery to enforce a singular, orthodox interpretation of Hindu life across the entire subcontinent. While the text contained the seeds of social inequality, those hierarchies gained their structural power from the legal fiction maintained by the British administration. To understand the history of South Asia, we must decouple the ancient Dharmaśāstra tradition from the Western legal framework that was forced upon it. History suggests that when we search for an authentic past, we often end up creating a version that better serves our current administrative needs. The story of the Manusmriti remains a cautionary tale of how mistaking moral philosophy for positive law can permanently reshape the trajectory of an entire civilization.